Every minute counts when it comes to emergency healthcare delivery. In some instances, the difference between survivors and the dead depends on how fast or late they receive medical attention. Now, politicians or influential people in society are often airlifted to major hospitals for treatment when they are involved in accidents or find themselves in conditions which demand emergency care. But the story is not the same for the ordinary Ghanaian, and in most instances, it takes only divine intervention for some of them to survive. In the following report, Manasseh Awuni takes us through the plight of an accident victim who was left to die after all means of getting transportation to the Kolebu Teaching Hospital failed.
Lukmanu had not stirred for the past 5 days. He had been in coma since his motorbike crashed into a tractor 5 days ago. Authorities at the Karachi Government Hospital could not resuscitate him and had referred him to the Kolebu Teaching Hospital in Accra. But there was one problem. The Karachi West District had no ambulance, and all attempts to get a means of transport to convey Lukmanu to the Kolebu Teaching Hospital had failed. So the 23-year-old man was left to his ultimate fate, death. But fortunately, Lukmanu did not have to die. A story I had done earlier about 11-year-old Kwajo Njofuni had touched the hearts of some individuals in Accra who sponsored his referral to the Kolebu Teaching Hospital. They had arranged for an ambulance from the Rara Hospital in the Volta region to convey Kwajo to Accra. But Lukmanu was in a critical situation, so he was considered for a ride in the same ambulance. He was put in the main compartment of the ambulance, while Kwajo, for whose sake the ambulance was there, had to settle somewhere else in the vehicle. But getting an ambulance after 5 days of being in coma was just the beginning of Lukmanu's torturous journey to receiving emergency health care. The road to Accra, especially from Kitikrachi to Dambai, is in a very deplorable state. In fact, some portions of the road look like a farm track. Because of this, we missed the first crossing of the ferry over the Oti River at Dambai at 8:30 a.m. We had to wait for close to an hour to cross. But that was a rare occurrence. It was simply because there were too many vehicles that morning, so the ferry had to cross the river twice. If we were the only one waiting to cross, we would have had to charter the ferry and pay the full fare, but that is too expensive. Our other option then would have been to wait until 4 p.m. when the ferry would cross again. The ambulance itself was not without faults. It had practically nothing on board apart from the compartment meant for carrying patients. The alarm system had also broken down. So we had to stay in Accra's heavy traffic when we finally arrived in the capital. But here again, we were fortunate. At about 500 meters to the Kolebu Teaching Hospital, we met this ambulance, which was also headed there. It had a siren, so we followed it. After nearly 10 hours, we finally arrived at the nation's premier teaching hospital. But little did we know that it was to mark the beginning of yet another harrowing story of emergency care in Ghana. The nurse who accompanied the patients from Kitikrachi to Accra went to the accident center but returned to announce that there was no bed or stretcher to carry the patients.
There is no stretcher, so we are coming to take this one, and then there is no bed as well.
No nurse or staff at the accident center bothered to find out who was in the ambulance or what his condition was. Personnel of the Ghana Ambulance Service also sat unconcerned. The driver of our ambulance then had to look for a makeshift stretcher to convey the patients. They will not accept the patient on that, the nurse said, and left immediately after issuing out her instructions that the patient be put back into the ambulance. Still, the National Ambulance Service staff did not come. The patient, who was still in coma, was being carried by unprofessional hands.
It's spoiled. But no, that is spoiled. It can't even move. No. It can't even stand.
Now watch this. A member of the ambulance service staff went close up and spoke in whispers to the patient's handler and the nurse who accompanied us to Kolebu. The accident victim's brother did not seem to understand the language, so the nurse pulled him aside and spoke to him in a layman's language. Mysteriously, a stretcher appeared.
Support you. Be at the side, sir.
But it was not free.
Well, actually, we paid something. It was not given because the man who came to beg on take something from us before we have the structure.
How much did it take?
There were two, so each of them took 10 cedis.
Lukmanu got neither a bed nor a ward, so he had to spend some days on the floor at the reception of the accident center. Director of the National Ambulance Service, Dr. Ahmed Nuhu Zakaria, says Ghana has made some progress in the provision of ambulances.
We started in 2004 with a pilot program of 7 stations. By the end of 2008, we had scaled up to 24 stations across the country. Now, since 2009 till date, we've been able to add an extra 161 stations. So as a country now, we can boast of 161 plus 24, which is about 185 stations. The idea is to try and make sure every district capital has a national ambulance service system.
He, however, admits that there are serious challenges to emergency healthcare delivery in the country.
The country, Ghana, does not have an air ambulance, which is a big disadvantage. A typical example before we come to this Kreche, for example, in Western region, we have this oil exploration. God forbid, supposing there is some emergency, how to evacuate the casualties to Kolebu or Konfanoche will be a challenge. So as a country, it's long overdue that we got an air ambulance. Now, this typical example of Krachi, to cross the river, it means if we had an air ambulance, that is what it should have been doing, airlift the casualties. Because remember, in emergencies, time is of essence. Because sometimes a delay of even 4 minutes can make a big difference. Because remember, the cells of the brain just have only 4 to 6 minutes to die irreversibly should there be any challenge of getting oxygen supply.
I recently visited Lukmanu and his family at Kitikrachi. As expected, he had no idea about the difficulty he had gone through.
I closed from work and was going home. I didn't know what happened. I realized I was at Kolebu. By God's grace, I got well and came home.
His mother, Happy Bawa, was very happy she was ending 2012 with her son because she had lost hope of ever seeing him alive.
I didn't know I would get my son again. When we were referred to Kolebu, we suffered a lot, but God finally intervened.
I also visited the Karachi Government Hospital. It is one of the hospitals which benefited from the distribution of 161 ambulances recently procured by government for health centers across the country. Dr. Felix Doe is the Karachi West District Director of Health Services.
Until recently, when the ambulance service started operation in the district, it's been very difficult referring patients to the regional hospital or Kolebu Teaching Hospital. Okay. Because the relatives have to find their own means of transport to send the patients to the hospitals. And it's not very easy in Karachi here. Most of the time, they have to get a vehicle to convey the patient to the lakeside, and then they get a boat to get them to the other side, that is Dambai. And then on reaching Dambai, they also have to look for a vehicle to send the patient to Ho or Accra, and that is not easy at all. Sometimes we are where they send some of the patients home to die.
Lukmanu's father, who is a tractor operator at the Karachi West District Assembly, was happy the district now had an ambulance. He was, however, quick to add that it has not taken away the trouble accident victims like his son will go through in the future.
The roads are very bad. The ambulance can even break down before reaching the hospital.
A couple of months back, you remember there were explosions in western region. A lot of them died because the time it would take to transport them to Kolebu, if you had an air ambulance, that would have been faster and quicker and it would have saved lives. So in reality, though we are doing our best, I think we still have a lot of room for improvement.
Call it sheer luck or divine intervention, and you may be right about how Lukmanu was saved. But how many people can be as lucky as he was? Districts such as Karachi West now have at least one ambulance to rely on. But it does not seem much will change until health workers at the hospitals change their attitude. And much may not change when one has to pay a bribe to get a stretcher to convey a patient to the accident center. Until these issues are dealt with, investing in the emergency healthcare delivery will be like pouring water into a basket. And ordinary Ghanaians like Lukman Bawa will only be waiting to die in times of emergency. For Joy News, Manasseh Azure Awuni reporting.
You're still live on Joy News at 8 on Joy News channel on Multi TV.